welcome to the, I guess, the last forum of this semester. Because I believe you all have something else to do in the next few weeks. Can't imagine. We do have a whole new season in the spring. So think of all those great lunches.
Great talks.
Yeah, and great talks. So I do not know Maggie at all, actually. Well, not very well. And I think that's true for most of us, because Maggie just started here this fall. And part of her talk will be, in a way, an introduction to Maggie Hansen. But I'm going to do this little official thing first, and then we'll be sort of located. She's a landscape designer whose work investigates how caretaking, which I see we're going to have a definition of space, of shared histories, and of caretakers themselves, serves to maintain and build community. Her work draws on her training in architecture from UVA. And was there another architecture school?
No, UVA was
UVA.
both degrees, yeah.
Landscape architecture, theater, which I hope we'll hear about, and contemporary art. From 2014 to 17, she served as director of Tulane's Small Center for Collaborative Design, where she led community-based design projects in support of a more equitable New Orleans. Under her leadership, the center launched an exhibition program and a panel discussion series exploring the big issues of our city, quote, piloted engagement strategies for youth of all ages, and fostered relationships across private and public sectors. The center's work is consistently recognized as a national and local leader for design and deep engagement. As a designer at Nelson Bird Waltz Landscape Architects, Maggie contributed to a range of projects, including the Brooklyn Naval Cemetery, Overlook Farm, Olana State Historic Site, and Hudson Yards East, which is now complete, no?
Yeah, well, still
almost.
somewhat in process,
All
but
right.
yeah.
So with that, let me introduce Maggie Hansen. Please welcome.
Thank you. I am so happy to be here and so glad to see so many of my students in attendance. My aim here today is, one, to give a little introduction to my work, but also to dive into some of the questions and theoretical reflections on expanded landscape practice that I'm currently working on through writing and case studies. I'm hoping to have ample time for conversation at the end, so I'm really looking forward to a dialogue and discussion that's going to inform a lot of ideas that are still very much in process. So my work recently, over the last couple of years, has been considering ideas of a feminist theory of care. There are a lot of writers who have defined care within a feminist framework, but the one that resonates, I think, the most for design is the writing of Joan Tronto. And she and her colleague Bernice Fisher in about 1994 wrote a description of an ethic of care that, I'll just read this, everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. That world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex, life-sustaining web. She and Bernice Fisher write about this in terms of a moral theory, but she comes from a political science background. And so her interest is really in how ideas of care can inform and support community in service of democratic action. It has recently been used in tech and in geography, and recently a lot of books coming out thinking about care theory in architecture as a way of critiquing uneven power structures that shape the social boundaries, that often suppress care work and care labor, making it invisible and also devaluing it. It's a feminist theory because often that care labor is put on women and racialized minorities. And so a way of revealing care is also a way of revealing the time and labor, as well as the people associated with care work. I found this really useful as a way of reflecting on my own work in community engaged practice, which, as Michael mentioned, was in New Orleans for 3 years, leading the Tulane City Center, which has become the small center for collaborative design. And through that work, we were thinking about a really holistic approach to prioritizing the needs of communities often left out of traditional planning processes by architectural interventions at multiple scales. One of the projects that we would use as a warm-up exercise for every studio, so each project that we were involved with community organizations always had students at the heart of the design work. And to get them into the mode of thinking holistically about design that goes beyond just an architectural object, we would do this assignment called Do Something. So over a weekend, every student would have to identify an issue or a concern in their neighborhood, make a slide that identified it, and then do something about it, and then reflect on the outcome of their intervention. And I think one of the simplest but also most beautiful was this project by Sue Poon, who had only recently moved to New Orleans and was frustrated that she was always lost because there were not very many street signs. And so she made a laminated sign on her street that would help others find themselves, but mostly just for herself, so that she could find her way home. And unintentionally, she participated in a tradition that is in New Orleans of making artistic street signs that reference the surrounding fonts and artwork and pinning it up. And so even these small actions of intervening in the world around us make the world easier for ourselves to live in, but also ideally for others to live in as well. I'm going to introduce two projects that were going on in New Orleans when I got there in 2014 and just wrapped up right before I left. And this is a way of just talking about the work that we did and our approach to it and what it means to think about design for change and try to make that happen. But it also is a way for us maybe to talk about when that doesn't go so well and when we don't meet all of the aspirations that we hope for, because these often are problems that cannot be solved by architecture alone. So while I stepped into the directorship, we had many projects in motion, but we were also getting pressure from our funders and people at the school to scale up. The center had been in existence for 8 years at that point. It started right after Hurricane Katrina as a response to the storm, but had kind of shifted into a way of empowering community groups through architecture. As I said, every project had students at the core as a learning opportunity, and every project ended in some physical manifestation, whether it was a built work or a booklet that described a vision for an idea that was used for fundraising. And it was important to us that every project came from a community group and was led through a lot of engagement along the way. Two projects, the Holly Grove Green Line and Parasite Skate Park, were looking at issues of public space, but also of managing regular flooding. They're both in low-lying areas of the city. If you think about New Orleans, it's a bowl. And so at the center, you're in low land. And in regular storm events, streets flood. And there are other issues of subsidence that impact homes and other spaces. The first project, Parasite, was a group of skaters from maybe 16 to 25 years old. And they had developed a DIY skate park in an area of land that was next to a railroad track, near an overpass, the typical sort of neglected spaces that start to serve other purposes. But the city had just continually come through and bulldozed their park. So they came to us asking if we could help them save their skate park. And they had unintentionally or intentionally cited their space near a New Orleans recreation department center that had restrooms and other services, and was at first one of the people that was getting their site bulldozed, but became an important ally along the way, and now is really involved in the site itself. This was a complicated site, and we thought that we were going to just do some simple advocacy work, use the two-lane name to get the city's support and a stamp of approval for something that we thought was interesting. But it turned into a 5-year project because it has federal jurisdiction, state jurisdiction associated with the highway overpass and the rail lines. And then it was actually on city property under the overpass. So we had to get everybody on board for this site to be used in an official way. Through that process, we developed a master plan with the skaters through models and charrettes, and eventually a vision document that talked about how the build out of the skate park would ideally go. We helped them form a nonprofit so that they could enter into an official maintenance agreement with the city, and we also spoke on their behalf to City Council. The resulting master plan at this point, 7 years later, has been built out and expanded. So in that way, it's a success. And we ended up, as a design build project, taking on the sort of front public space that's not part of the skate park, but is a viewing platform for families and other visitors. Part of the work framing the skate park was talking about this as an active recreation center, and also showing that it was a really diverse space where kids from across the city were coming together to skate, and were learning from one another different skate tricks, but we're also coming together to maintain the space, clean it up on a weekly basis. And they actually institutionalized a weekly cleanup of the site as a way of showing to the city that if they put in rainwater gardens, they would be maintained and they wouldn't be just junky garbage pits, which was what the city was worried about. So this is that public space. We ended up getting a local artist to do the sign on the overpass, which was actually one of the more challenging negotiations. And it is a really active site now. The other project, Holly Grove Green Line, is also in a low-lying area of the city, and also started as just a helping out visioning project and then evolved to be much more. This was a neighborhood association that was working with AARP to think about how a decommissioned rail line through their neighborhood could become a public space that was also a generator of new residents in a neighborhood that was depopulating. We helped them think through different issues that they needed from the city, just in terms of stormwater maintenance, but also advocated in terms of getting this site, which you can see is fenced off and fairly neglected, city-owned property that cut through and divided their neighborhood because of the fencing. One of the challenges is that line under the rail line had been claimed by water infrastructure. And so there was a lot of sensitivity from the Sewer and Water Board about any ideas to occupy that site, to build anything on the site, to make transformations over this embedded tunnel that really drained the entire city, still does. through our master planning, we ran a studio that looked at possible futures. And then as we identified a space to actually do a pilot of this, this was the selected proposal that starts to look at areas of stormwater collection, areas of seeding, and a line of trees that marks the green line. In negotiations with the city, we were able to use one site that would be our pilot and would demonstrate success, which was not over that sensitive drainage channel. It also happened to be a site that was identified by the community as their neighborhood front door, because the pink line shows the bus that many of them use to get to and from work. So this bus stop was the challenge for a pilot site of occupying this green line. We used this as a way of marking the neighborhood history, telling stories of the rail line that they all had memories of, and pride in a commuter rail line that brought people into the city. We also used it as a place to talk about streets and areas that would flood during rain events and to get some attention to improving those conditions. And we created a bus stop as an architecture intervention that highlights and demonstrates the movement of water and its channeling into a cistern and a series of rain gardens to slow it and process it. So in terms of the School of Architecture, both of these are successes because they both won design awards. They both were constructed. They both have fulfilled the design prompt that we gave ourselves. But in terms of ideas of progressing a community's agenda, Parasite has continued to gain grant money and other support and is growing their programming as well as advising other DIY skate parks across the country. And the Green Line has really struggled. As a pilot, we were hoping that it would demonstrate the use of public space, the care of this public space as a way of rebuilding a fragmented community in the Holly Grove neighborhood. But the reality is that many of the people who volunteered to care for it have moved out of the community for a variety of reasons. And the community that is there doesn't have the capacity to continue to care for it. So we have come back, or now the center has come back over and over to try to rebuild and reconnect the site to various nonprofits, a school, a church, and now a new nonprofit organization in the area just to get basic maintenance done. And I think one of the dangers is that once it looks uncared for, then it starts to have a rippling effect of reinforcing a lack of care for that space that has other implications for the agenda of the community as well. So in our reflection on this, as well as the sort of 85 other projects that the center has done, my colleagues and I started to think about a sort of theory of work that thinks more holistically about what our responsibilities as designers are if we're engaged in these sort of social practice projects. How to think about them holistically and how we define our role. And I think that that's where, I know that that's where Joan Tronto's writing on care has really helped me get my head around an attitude towards design work that thinks about the things that are not architecture and starts to articulate the role of social practitioners in developing relationships on the ground, developing sustained work that's context specific, and thinking about how small interventions are connected to larger systems of social ideas and social occupation, as well as for landscape designers, environmental systems. We don't often talk about design as a caregiving practice, but recently I've been writing about and looking at examples of how design is a caregiving practice, and how, if we think about it within this framework, it allows us to reveal the power dynamics that are often in the way of big change. And it also suggests ways of working that are not typical to design, but help us to structure everyday life and the flow of material and human resources. For landscape in particular, care is really meaningful because our projects are dynamic. They respond to the surrounding context, and they respond to human actions. And so the actions of care are at the heart of what can be successful and how our designs might be realized. I think in showing the ways that we might define an expanded practice defined by care, it's useful to use Tronto and Fisher's 5 phases of care. These are just ways of thinking about care and the care actions that are very interlocked and often happen simultaneously, but call attention to the questions that we need to ask ourselves. The first is caring about. This is when we recognize that care is needed. And she writes about this as being the role of attention, and that the particular challenge is that sometimes the needs are easy to ignore. Sometimes they are deliberately ignored because of existing power dynamics. And often needs are in conflict, right? My needs as a designer are not necessarily the same as the community organization that I am working with. And this is where writers who've been talking about engaged practice, Dan Patera, Liz Ogbu, are all really useful in talking about how conversations and ways of doing a participatory practice allow us to break down and challenge the existing power dynamics. The next is caring for. This is how we accept responsibility. It's the moment when we decide to do something and we decide what we're going to do. This is where we define who else is responsible, and we think through the entire process of our care work, thinking as designers from how materials are sourced, who's going to do the work, how the construction is going to do, as well as afterwards when we consider where, upkeep, designing of ideas of change over time, and we consider the impact of our proposed care. This is the sort of cradle to cradle aspects of design. And perhaps that looks like some of Julie Bargman's work, reusing existing things on site and recalling the histories of a site. Caregiving is the most challenging in many ways because it's the direct actions of care. I think that there are a couple different considerations that are important for us to bring into design conversation. And one is how we can identify what new forms of care action might take place. Here, Dirt Studio proposed a new set of green jobs that are all surrounding the idea of care of the soil in New Orleans, and a new industry that might clean the soil and bring it to market as a valuable good in New Orleans, where much of the soil is contaminated with lead. But it also might just mean being more thoughtful about the care of the folks who construct and maintain our spaces. Here, Who Builds Your Architecture is a group that's been looking at the role of migrant workers in the globalized architecture and how many of them are in very precarious situations. As landscape architects, this might mean considering exposure to glyphosate and the problems that that causes, But it also is an issue of equity in that many of the people maintaining public spaces are poorly paid and are working in a sort of day shift way. So how do we revalue those? But it also means that everyone within the process is taken care of. And there's an important conversation going on right now about care of designers and the way that we make sure that we are taken care of, what studio culture actually means, what advancement in design means, and how that is balanced against other things in our lives. The Vela project is looking particularly at the advancement of women and how, though many women, many of the awards at the student level are won by women students, there's a significant decrease as we look at advancing through the career ladder. And then care receiving is when we reflect on how we did. And we often identify other care needs that starts this whole process of care all over again. Here at Brooklyn Naval Cemetery, that meant that full-time caretakers needed to be hired for the park rather than relying on volunteer labor who were not doing a good enough job on a regular basis of removing invasive species that threatened the design. And then the last, which is a new thing that Toronto has started writing about, is the idea of caring with, that reliable care builds solidarity and trust and therefore builds community and investment in place. This Turnscape project I find really inspiring, that an entire campus is given over to the production of rice and buckwheat, and that there's a ritual of planting and a ritual of harvest that faculty, staff, and students all participate in each year as a sort of marking of the calendar. But we can also think about this in terms of seeing care being done and feeling cared for, that inspires us to think differently about the places and people around us, and hopefully inspires us to reciprocate that. That those, as Danielle Allen writes about, are the basis of democratic action, right? Our sacrifices being reciprocated forms friendships and ideas of trust across difference. When I first started looking at these, I was inspired by a range of artists, performance artists who have looked at maintenance art. Kelly's work shaking the hand of every sanitation worker in New York and photographing it, or having performances that demonstrate the incredible skill of these sanitation workers in moving machinery and moving the waste of New York all around in this orchestration and choreography across the city that keeps things going, right? Maintenance is the thing that supports the rest of our lives. I've also been interested by early mid-century practitioners like Marjorie Cotley, who in her design for Radburn, New Jersey, developed these semi-public pedestrian footways that were the sort of second front of the house. And encouraged folks to have visual as well as, pathway access to one another, and play spaces that mothers could look out across. But she also advocated for local laborers to be involved in collecting plant specimens and the construction and installation of all of her projects, building on her experience working in the WPA and bringing that forward as a way of being thoughtful about who was hired and who benefited from the jobs created by suburban expansion. But I think that these examples start to suppress what's really at the heart of care, which is an ethic of care is a fundamental challenge to the existing cultural structures. As we look at care, we have to deal with the question of how care has often been suppressed and made invisible, and the people associated with that are also devalued. And that's where I think we need to go a little bit further back into ideas that developed in the progressive era, where women involved in the suffrage movement were also thinking about their civic life, advocating for a civic voice, and demonstrating that their role as caretakers had a meaning at the scale of the city. And Jane Addams' work developing Hull House, creating a place-based program that was involved in the reform of child labor, cleaning up contaminated sites in neighborhoods associated with industry. Her work in women's suffrage at the national level and also as a founding member of the NAACP. She saw linked with her on-the-ground work in the west side of Chicago, informed by her everyday experiences of living in that neighborhood and talking with the neighbors there, as well as her larger vision of world peace. That it was place-specific, but it also was aspiring to a larger goal, larger change. Similarly, Melusina Pierce and other material feminists, Dolores Hayden, has written about, were writing speculative fiction about futures that were much more equitable, and the spaces that they inhabit had many more collective spaces that were dealing with domestic labor and shared ways of living together. And Melusina Pierce actually piloted a program of cooperative housekeeping in Cambridge for several years, where it was mostly Harvard faculty, but many people across Cambridge were paying into a fund that supported wives coming together, making food, doing laundry, doing dishes, as a way of developing a model of economic independence for women, but also for bringing together women in the same space so that they weren't isolated in their own households, but were coming together as a unified group of folks. She also was involved in architecture and had many patents for ideas of cooperative housing. And so I think, to me, these are inspiring in terms of thinking about how physical arrangement of environment is intrinsically involved in other social ideas of how we live and in challenging the ways that we live now. And so in terms of thinking about my own speculations of the future, I think this brings us back to the questions of landscape practice. And to me, it's important to think of how we are inextricably linked to other humans, non-human species, and material things that we encounter during our lives, that we share our spaces and our cities and our planet with all of them. We impact them, but they also impact us. And so valuing care is a way of demonstrating this exchange and this interconnectedness. And our work as designers is often about bridging the world that we can imagine far into the future that probably looks much different than the physical environment that we live in, but also identifying those first steps to making it a reality. That is all I have today.
That's all. Well, what a rich field of dialogue, and let's do it. Who cares? All right, go.
Well, I think it's really interesting that prioritize community engagement in practice, because I think that's something that is rare, it should be more explored. And I'm curious if you use a methodology to engage with the community in all these projects, or if it was more like an informal process, or different,
Yeah, so I know from my colleagues that following Katrina, a lot of things were happening in an ad hoc manner. And so there was an intention around engaged process, and there was work that was informed by all of the writers and who've been a part of, structuring community engaged work for a long time. But I think recently that has been expanded to be more formalized. And we were working in a way that was really intentional about recognizing expertise and creating conversations that were around specific questions that would capitalize on the expertise of people in the room. And so that meant that it wasn't everyone all together, every community member, every designer in every single participatory meeting, but that there were certain people who could talk about ability to fundraise for the continuation of the project. There were others where it was a structured conversation around the thing that we were going to make and how that was best going to serve the organization and what they needed. And sometimes those conversations were with the whole organization to understand the everyday needs, and sometimes they were just with the leadership, right? And so it ended up being a lot more moments of connection and being intentional about those conversations. But we were able to get much further in the same way that you would have a design conversation with a consultant, but in valuing a larger range of expertise to include everyday knowledge of a neighborhood, everyday use of spaces, and then also to start to bring in and form support systems around a project. So we would bring other folks from public health into conversations that were associated with public health, so that we were also linking our nonprofit partners into the larger web of the city. So hopefully it was working both directions. Our students also did a lot of participatory observation, which was often in the form of volunteering. And there are so many things that you can see as a volunteer with a design lens that you're never going to get from someone just answering your questions or responding to a design proposal. And so that was a really useful way for them to start to absorb the immediate needs by just spending time and also building relationships of trust through contributing.
I may not be able to articulate this well,
Yeah.
but I'm interested in the economics of like the fundraising for the care and maintenance, where that's the less glamorous side
Yeah.
of fundraising, and how do you or do you not separate out in those fundraising or sponsorship questions your funds are going towards this beautiful creation versus your funds are going towards the ongoing maintenance that may not be as exciting for people who are being solicited?
Right. Yeah, I think that that's a big question, and I think that that's where the world that I am aspiring to is different than the world that we live in, right? And so the questions in some ways are about how we as designers advocate for those skilled roles as a way of making it less atypical, to make it more typical that there are funds for more dynamic and more care-intensive landscapes, right? I think that we have, in some ways, necessarily conceded a lot of ground by creating landscapes that are no maintenance or are easy to care for in a way that I think doesn't advance the other goals of landscape architecture.
It's like hardened buildings. You harden a building
Yeah.
to make it low maintenance.
But I think that it also means that, well, ideas of care are challenging ideas of capitalism, and Tronto talks about that. And it is a challenge to the existing systems to say that it is incredibly valuable to pay people to do very skilled labor of taking care of the plants and the soil and the creatures that we coexist with. But I think that to really address the larger issues of global warming, sea level rise, biodiversity extinction, we need to engage in that conversation, and we need to find ways of starting to pilot that more and more. So I don't know exactly what the path is, and it is certainly multifaceted, but it is absolutely within our set of concerns. And I don't think that it's something that we should allow to exist without conversation and critique.
Me?
Yes, you.
I thought you were like pointing. So I was kind of wondering about some design techniques that you might have for spatializing these agendas of care when we're not kind of starting from a building for building's sake or architecture for architecture's sake. Like, how do you begin to really spatialize these in your design in a way that kind of respects the process that you built up? And then also kind of adjoiningly, just kind of like how might you insert this if it hadn't already been established that this was kind of your agenda? Like, how do you begin to bring these concerns or address these concerns into a party that might not be concerned about that in the first place?
Yeah. Well, I think the first question in terms of how you start to spatialize it is first by studying it. And I had, we talked a lot in my graduate landscape education about ideas of change over time. And there are some, beautiful drawings of thickets of trees that get larger and the space is made for them to get larger. But the actual actions that take place in order for that to happen, I didn't get exposure to until I was in practice. And I also know that because I have been renting for the last 10 years and don't have a garden, I also am out of touch with some of the other regular things that you learn by being in contact with plants and their care. So I think in some ways it's about using your curiosity to make sure you understand the process so that you can design alongside it and visualize it. That might mean that we change some of the ways that we teach plants. I also think that it's working closely with people who know this stuff really well. And that's how I learned in practice, is by having, and botanists as our consultants who we worked really closely with, and places that you visit and people that you can ask questions of, because we can't know everything. So we have to rely on others. So there's that. I think the second, the sort of advocacy role, I know from my work at NBW that we were often working with clients who wanted to be a part of the research that we were doing on how conservation could overlay with productive space. And those conversations were structured as a set of trainings almost about thinking long term, about things that would happen now that had longer term impacts, and also negotiating how folks could have an immediate feeling of the design and experience they wanted while thinking long range. So sometimes that meant that we were planting larger trees near their house, and other areas were being evolved as designed forest over time. But it was partially about bringing the scientists in to talk about what they observed, and then also doing the design proposals that were responsive to a set of agendas that visualized what that would look like 100 years from now when none of us are there. So it's political. It's a structured conversation, but it also has to come from a set of shared goals. And I think that that's where our work at Tulane was always about checking back on the goal that we were all trying to get to make sure that that was guiding every decision that we made. I think our role as strategists in design is something that we could talk about and skill build around a lot more, right? That the strategy of how we approach large problems and get people on board is a really important skill, whether we're working on high-end residential terraces or ideas of conservation at a large scale. Yeah.
I took a course last year called Critical Geographies of Health, and I feel like that course helped put this in perspective in a way where we focus on many aspects, but primarily on the marginalized communities and the way politics, geography, everything comes into play. And my professor was actually a feminist geographer. So I would like to know more about your comings with the health issues, like you mentioned the contaminated soil, and what health aspects you ran into, how you dealt with them as a designer, and more about your, I guess, feminist perspective on the process of the projects.
That sounds like a great course. Yeah, I want to take that.
Not geography.
It was part of the undergraduate studies.
That's great.
Geography.
Yeah. Well, so I have a liberal arts background from college, in which I chose to take a lot of women's studies classes because I've always been fascinated in by these questions. So in some ways, this is a return to some of those conversations. But I think we often, we think at this sort of large planning scale. Sometimes, often in landscape, we'll stay focused at that scale. And I think the questions that feminist scholars bring us back to are the experience of our bodies as the first way of understanding the world. And to me, as a designer, that makes the importance of space making at the scale of the body so important. And so how we connect the large agenda at the huge, huge scale to the scale of my own body and my experience is what makes me excited to be a designer. A lot of the work that I showed that was dealing with contaminated soils was not my own work. But Julie Bargman with Dirt Studio was working with the artist Mel Chin, as well as a set of scientists, Dr. Menke, who does research about lead in soils. And so it was a project that was in conversation with scientists who were actively researching the soil and their theories about how lead might be contained by adding specific things to the soil. In this case, it was an idea of molasses and sugar and the waste from processed waste from sewer processing. and that there was a chemical reaction that would bind with the lead that would make it safer. And so they were proposing this as a test situation where the artist was helping to bring advocacy and attention to this as an issue that was across the city. The scientists were proposing the actual way of treating the soil, and the landscape designer was spatializing that. And I think that there was a lot of attention to the sort of environmental issues of this, but the important layer of the social issues of how spaces that were contaminated are seen as off limits suddenly become available, not just as spaces for human beings to be, but also as possible economic generators, that the cleanup of, all of our industrial processes is something that is urgently needed and also is of great value to us as a society, is an interesting set of questions, an important set of questions to be looking at a landscape scale. Yeah.
How is your notion of care distinct from the notion of cure?
Of cure.
Just one letter different.
Beyond spelling. I think that cure suggests that there is an end, right? That there is a moment where we've achieved it. Yeah. And care is defined as being ongoing. It's never over. It is iterative, so you observe change that is hopefully positive change, but then you recognize other things that need to happen. It also is defined as being ideally reciprocal. So, one day I may care for you, but later you also recognize a reciprocal relationship of care to me. And cure seems to be about fixing something.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like sometimes it's easy to fall in that like double falsity between one or the other.
Yeah.
Whereas cure recognizes like a diagnosis. This is what it's wrong, and then therefore going to fix it.
Yeah.
Whereas care is about like a deeper understanding of other things, and that it is like a responsible relationship between two extremes.
Yeah, yeah.
So, if you don't mind, your first definition that put up by Tronto and
Bernice Fisher, yeah, Joan Tronto.
I noticed the three action words in there were maintain.
Mm-hmm.
What were they?
Maintain, continue, and
Like preserve
repair.
and repair. Right, so that should be the cure part.
Yeah.
But it seems like to transform this into an ethic of design,
Mm-hmm.
one you'd have, because maintain, continue, and repair is not design.
Mm-hmm.
Is simply put design in there. Just say care design work or design care work is to design everything such that we will want to maintain, continue, and repair it. In other words, it becomes a design objective. Let's make something that people will care for, or that people will be inspired to try to maintain, and so on and so forth. So when you design no maintenance landscapes and no maintenance hardened buildings, which is how we design high schools, for example, and prisons, that's the idea. The idea is to cut down the cost of maintenance and repair at all costs. And you're absolutely right. It cuts out a continuing human relationship to built objects and to built landscapes. So, whether that requires a change in how we finance projects is one way to do it, but probably has more to do with having design vocabulary change such that the objective, or one of the main objectives, is how would this continue to be cared for? Why would it continue to be cared for? And how does the project fund its own maintenance or its own preservation?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways that makes a lot of sense to me. But I think there's also an added layer, especially for landscape space,
Okay.
wherein the maintenance is an active creation, right?
Okay.
That the sort of ongoing nature of landscape space is one of the things that really is different from
Right,
architecture.
because things die, things need constant.
Right, and
attention
the
and so
role
forth.
of pruning and making making the form that we're aspiring to.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
So that isn't, no, that's a wonderful difference, but
yeah.
all one has to do is call it out, but the ethic can be the same.
Yes,
And
yes,
they're just different kinds of objects as well.
yeah. I think to me there's also the sort of the feedback that caretakers make observations of those changes that are important bits of
And
information.
architects never do. They don't.
And that information is both about how the project is functioning, but also sometimes generate new spatial responses, right?
Sure.
That the dynamics of landscape changing over time is an important set of aspects that we have to conceptualize and engage with.
Stuart Brand wrote a book. Anyone remember the name of Stuart Brand?
How Buildings Learn.
How Buildings Learn, which is also takes a very long time perspective.
Yeah.
It's clearly different to trees and plants, but I think in the large view, not so much.
Right,
Yeah.
right. In the mega view, it is all the same
Jake,
project.
did you want to throw something in?
No.
Okay.
I think there's also an interesting, like you mentioned, caring, but also like conversely healing and thinking about care work and like this idea of repairing and healing is like an ongoing thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then we're talking about like interjecting like a design objective into it.
Yeah.
But there's like also a lot of unlearning that we have to do with our design objectives to integrate
Oh,
these ideas
totally.
of care
Yeah.
and this ongoing process of healing as well. So it's like the design objective has to be repaired, but also, there's all these other aspects that fall into that.
I guess maybe
Yeah.
just because I'm a damn architect, I'm very protective of what it means to design, what it means to imagine, marshal resources, strategize, metaphorize, all these things in the act of actual conception or creation or specification, which I don't think is the same as maintaining, repairing, and so forth. And the idea is to make a whole out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And thank you. I mean, it's a wonderful perspective.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed your talk. I completely agree, like the need to shift sort of the classic ways of thinking more into care work. But one of the things, I don't know literature at all, so that's my question. One of the things I've anecdotally observed among those who often have, whether by desire or circumstance, devoted a lot of their bandwidth to care, is there's a point that some individuals hit where you lose yourself a little bit in the giving of care to others, which psychologically isn't always helpful. And I wonder if the literature deals with, obviously we're on one end of that spectrum, but have you found literature dealing with the other end of that spectrum where it's on the
Care too much?
Yeah, it is. Well, it is something that they talk about a lot, which is why one of the metrics to know if you have succeeded in achieving true care is that everyone involved is cared for. Caretakers are also cared for, and the need to care for ourselves is an important aspect of giving care for all the reasons that you mentioned, that if you start to burn out, then you are of no use, that it's a source of resentment and therefore can no longer be a caring relationship. But it calls attention also to the power dynamics of those who often are forced into roles of continued care, without reciprocity, that if these things no longer are invisible, then we can also look out for one another and ensure that that we're not losing ourselves, right? That we're able to live to our full capacities. Yeah.
Okay, one more question and then we'll close. Thanks.
Okay.
One of the other things I think about, so if we start to take this and apply it at a more urban scale, on the idea of caretakers and caring for them, you talked about, there's this devaluing or the undervalue of care labor, which is done by women and racialized minorities. And in Sandy Rosenblum's Women in Transportation class, we talk a lot about how women as care laborers use and move through the city so much, just a lot differently than men do. They make way more trips throughout the day as care laborers. And I think as designers, when we start to realize those differences and we start to value that care labor and think about, okay, how can we design the city knowing that women use it differently and move through it differently, I think that gives us some different imperatives in terms of design. It's not really a question.
Well, thank you for bringing up some wonderful, thoughtful topics.
Thank you.
Thank you for introducing yourself to us all.
Thank you.